Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 121st episode of the Writ Podcast. Today I'm joined by David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data. He came on the show a few months ago. We went deep into the details of some polling numbers, and it was such an interesting episode I wanted to do it again. So here he is. David, thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure, Eric. This is always fun. Good to see you.
So we should start out with the methodology, not the methodology, but what this is. So last time what you did was pulled together a number of national surveys to get a very big sample, and you've done the same thing this time.
Yeah, so we have 5 national surveys that we've conducted between January 3rd and March 6th. So these are the 5 surveys we would have released publicly. We've pulled them all together. Gets us a sample size of almost 10,000 respondents. So we got 9,763. And just to give listeners the context, when you look at the ballot question for all of those, the results are of committed voters: Conservative 41, Liberal 24, NDP 19, Bloc 8, Green 4, and People's Party 3. So pretty close to it's actually the average, I would say, of all of Abacus's polls for this first part of the year, but close to what a lot of the other polls were saying. Not a lot of change happened in this period, and so I think it's a good snapshot to combine them all and get a sense of some of the deeper demographic, regional, and political dynamics at play in Canada right now.
Yeah, because with the sample of this size, we can really go into some of the details, not just, the big age groups and gender. We can really get into it. So before we do that, let's maybe start with some general views of sort of the demographic profile of where people are right now. How would you kind of describe that?
I think the overall story is one in which the Conservatives, when you look at, for example, vote intention, have had a lead and have a lead in this kind of aggregate among all age groups. They lead both men and women. You break down even age by gender, they're ahead pretty much across the board. You look at different levels of education, income levels. It's a pretty broad-based lead. And that reflects, I think, first, the size of the lead. When you're leading nationally by, 17, 18 points, odds are you're probably leading among every demographic group. But there's also, I think, an interesting dynamic that, yes, the Liberals and the New Democrats do better, for example, the New Democrats do better among younger folks. Conservatives, Liberals seem to be doing better among older Canadians and among women, as are the New Democrats. The differences aren't large enough right now that they are likely making much of a difference in terms of the overall story.
Right. Yeah. So the youngest cohort, are the Conservatives still leading among youngest voters? Is it the NDP? Because even like you say, the Liberals doing better among older voters, the Conservatives are still leading, right? It's all relative to sort of their national support right now.
Sorry, I'm just looking at it. So when you look at age, yeah, the Conservatives, I even was able to pull out by smaller age groups. So like 18 to 22-year-olds, the Conservatives are ahead in our sample by 10 points over the New Democrats, 8 points over the Liberals. Among 23 to 26-year-olds, they're ahead by 12 over the NDP. So the NDP is doing better among younger voters, but the Conservatives still lead literally among every single sub-age group that we look at. It's that youngest cohort is their weakest base, but they hold even a statistically significant lead among that younger cohort.
Okay, yeah, and has it been a broad-based increase? Is it particular one age group that has had more of an increase than another? Because, like you said, when you're this far ahead, it's going to be rare to find a demographic where you're not leading. But is the growth being driven by middle-aged voters, young voters, older voters? What is behind the increase in the support for the Conservatives when we're just talking about age?
Yeah, if you just look at age, I think what's important to note is the biggest swing has come among younger Canadians overall. So we're seeing a swing away from the Liberals anywhere between 7 to 10 points among young voters, but we also see some demographics in sort of the middle-aged groups where we're also seeing significant swings. The group that has swung the most, if we just look at sheer numerics, has been those aged 47 to 51. There was been a 14-point swing away from the Liberals to the other parties. But then the second highest is the youngest cohorts. So there's this almost bipolar or bimodal kind of swing happening where a lot of middle-aged Canadians are sort of leaving the Liberal Party in terms of their vote intention for, I think, separate reasons and different reasons than that youngest cohort. But those are the two largest. But it's also important to note that there's no one single age cohort, except for the oldest. So those over 77 are the only ones that we've seen a slight uptick in actual support for the Liberals versus where they were in 2021. Every other cohort has seen a significant, either 5 points or more swing away from the Liberals.
And do we see any difference in terms of gender? Because we do see, the Conservatives still lead among women, but the gap among men is huge. The gap among women is just large, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it, but there is differences when it comes to age, when it comes to men and women.
There is, and what we see is, younger men, for example, have been the biggest exodus, have had the biggest exodus. 14 points among men under the age of 30 have left the Liberals, compared to only 7.5% among women of that same age group. So they've lost both men and women, young men and women, but far more of any young men that supported them in the past. And we see the same kind of dynamic happening among older men and women. In fact, but older men actually, I think because they probably supported the Liberals, were less likely to support the Liberals in the past anyways, haven't moved as much as older women. But it's really, interestingly, not a big gender gap on the switch, right? Women have tended to support the Liberals more historically anyways. And so the switch that we've seen among them matters, but it's pretty uniform swing right across different ages and genders.
It does suggest a number of things has worked well for the Conservatives. We know that, like, Pierre Poilievre's, I don't know, more online kind of persona, you could say that, has particularly been geared towards younger men. And you do see that there has been a big movement among young men towards the Conservatives. And the efforts they've made to soften Pierre Poilievre's image to try to appeal to women does seem like that has also had a bit of an impact. So you can kind of see in all of these numbers that the strategies that they've been employing for the last year and a half have been working well.
And I think it's a two-pronged strategy, or at least two conditions that needed to happen, right? I believe most of the reason why people have embraced the Conservatives is mainly at this point still a rejection of the Liberals than it is a full-scale embrace of Mr. Poilievre, the Conservatives. That being said, to your point, I think the Conservatives have been very effective at not giving these younger voters, these younger men in particular, or any, frankly, switcher, a reason not to embrace the Conservatives, right? They've been so focused on the issues, generally speaking, that people care the most about, that if you're a young person who feels like housing is too hard to obtain, housing ownership is too hard to obtain, or you're worried about getting evicted and finding another place to rent, Pierre Poilievre has a story to tell you. If you're a senior who is worried about the cost of living and worried about the impact that the carbon tax increase might have, Pierre Poilievre has a story for you. And the Liberal government, I think, hasn't been as effective, in part because they've been in power for so long. So I do think the Conservatives have been very successful. We see, for example, we'll talk more about these switchers in a moment, but those that have switched from the Liberals to the Conservatives, they overwhelmingly dislike Mr. Trudeau, and interestingly, they overwhelmingly like Mr. Poilievre. So there is something about Mr. Poilievre that is attracting them, and I think we need to give him and the party credit for their work on that front.
So, we often talk a lot about age and gender. We don't talk about as much education. Education in the United States is often a huge driver of political support. Do we see any of those same kind of patterns here, where there is a big difference between high school, college, university, no high school, that kind of thing?
We do, but it's not as big as it used to be. There were times in the last 10 years when we've done polling in coming out of the Stephen Harper years where education was actually, like in the US, a pretty strong predictor of how you might vote, with those with high university or higher education typically more likely to vote liberal, and those with a college or only a high school education more likely to vote conservative. That has dissipated to some extent, where we are seeing, for example, the conservatives doing quite well among those with all levels of education, including postgraduate degrees, which in this survey sample we can look at because of the size of the sample. But there are some variations there. So, among men, the conservatives have made big gains among men with a university education, but haven't made as big gains among women with the same kind of education. So there's some differences happening below the surface of education when you intersect it with gender. But I think a big part of the story for the conservatives is that they have broken into a demographic or a socioeconomic group that they haven't traditionally been able to connect with. And again, that's why I still believe this is a lot of that is driven by just disappointment in the Liberals than a full-scale, full-on embrace and support of what the Conservatives are offering the country right now.
And is it just the Conservatives? Are we seeing any movement? Some of these, the disappointed Liberals, particularly those who, have a university education, post-grad degree, are any of them moving to the NDP?
Some of them, yeah, particularly among women. We're seeing the NDP gain 2 to 3 points among women with a college degree, with a bachelor's degree. Again, so they're not all going to the Conservatives, but the Conservatives, for example, among women with a postgraduate degree, the Conservatives have gained almost 10 points from where they were in 2021. The Liberals have lost 10. And so, the Conservatives are getting still most of that gain, but the NDP are certainly gaining some. Where they're not gaining and where they've actually lost support, the New Democrats, is among men with lower levels of education, right? So one of where the Conservatives have been particularly, I think, effective is at pulling men in the trades. We'll talk about union members in a moment, but I think they've been very good at that, and the NDP has seen some of that support drop.
Yeah, well, let's move on to that. So you do have breakdowns for people who are in the private sector unions, public sector unions, non-unionized, and I think you even have gender breakdowns by the union. So that's what you can do when you have this many people taking parts in polls. So what are the broad strokes from how that union vote is looking? Because we know that Doug Ford and the PCs were very successful as targeting particularly the private sector union people in the last provincial election. How's it working for the federal Conservatives?
So again, right across the board, you've seen anywhere between 6% to 11% increases among unionized workers, but some differences, right? So if we look at, for example, public sector union members, the Conservatives have seen a 7-point increase in their support. The Liberals are down 12, and the NDP are just up 2, right? So again, Liberal drop, a little bit goes to the New Democrats, most goes to the Conservatives, and that's among public sector unions. So think teachers, nurses, federal public servants, provincial public servants, municipal public servants. But where the gains have been the greatest for the Conservatives, or at least slightly larger, is among that private sector unionized worker, where we've seen an 8-point increase for the Conservatives. The NDP have gained almost nothing from the previous year. And when you actually, as you said, drill down and look at, let's say, men who are unionized and work in the private sector, we've seen a Conservative gain of almost 11 points. That's the largest swing among unionized workers. So if their strategy has been to connect with, like Doug Ford did in Ontario, private sector unionized workers who typically are more male than female in that environment, they've been very successful at attracting them, and is one of the groups that we've seen the largest increase. So as I've said all along, there's this broad-based swing to the Conservatives. If you isolate who's more likely to be coming over, private sector unionized men employed right now are one of the best for the Conservatives.
In the polling, you had some breakdowns by sort of jobs, like how you would describe it. And I thought it was really interesting because it gives us a view of who is supporting each party. So I pulled out the top results you had. So among Conservatives, you had people in the construction industry, people in the professional, scientific, financial services, manufacturing, logistics, transportation, warehousing. Those are the groups that the Conservatives did the best in. For the Liberals, it was people who work for not-for-profits, charities, in personal services, in the arts, cultural, sports, entertainment, and recreation. And then for the NDP, it was also the arts, but then also wholesale trade, and then the healthcare and education field. I feel like this gives almost a stereotypical view of who the supporters of each of these parties would be right now.
I think it does. And other than like the professional, scientific, financial services group, which I think swing, they're probably much more likely to move around. They don't perfectly fit into, the mold I think that Pierre Poilievre is trying to build in terms of who he best represents. But yeah, construction workers, those working in manufacturing, those driving trucks are overwhelmingly, like close to 50% or more of them say they're going to vote conservative if the election were held today. And then you're left with those in the public sector to some extent, in the arts, in nonprofit, saying, look, I'm gonna vote Liberal or NDP. And I think that I don't know if I'd call it a realignment, but there's certainly some alignment happening where I think the policy and the rhetoric coming from the Conservatives are very much attracting these kinds of workers. And you see it in other parts, as we've already talked about, in terms of private sector unionized employees. This is just reinforcing that. Many construction workers, many in manufacturing, many in logistics and transportation are unionized, private unions, and so they're really embracing the Conservatives at this moment.
Are there any, again, we've talked about the broad movements and that how it generally has been uniform. When you gave me all of this data and there was so much to go through, for the Liberals, it was often that whatever they were losing, if they lost 10 points, it was generally everywhere. It was between 8, 12 points for like every category. The Conservatives had a little bit more difference, but within these job categories, do we see any kind of significant movement since the last election in the direction that people are going?
Not really. Where maybe we ask that question slightly different. Where hasn't there been some significant movement? And the only groups that show lower than average swings are basically professionals. So think professional, scientific, financial services, your accountants, your David Coletto's, doing market research, consultants kind of thing, and in professional services. So think hair. And those kinds of things, hairdressers and estheticians and stuff like that. Beyond that, we're looking at 9+% swings across the board in every type of profession. And I think that's, again, indicative of just the state of public opinion right now. But there are still, who's not swinging probably reflects some hesitation and the demographics and socioeconomic makeup of who are in those professions, right? If I think of that professional class in Canada, I do think that Pierre Poilievre is probably offside with a lot of the way they view the world and what they want to see in political leaders. But even among that group, he's made, a 6-point gain, or they've moved from the Liberals, and he's gained 4% among that group. So it's still not insignificant. If we think that, again, I always try to remember, like, the Conservatives won the popular vote in 2021. Eric, you know this probably better than me. What would they have needed to win a majority in that election? Probably 5-6 points. They're getting that easily right across the board right now. So even if they started to lose certain groups, or they lost some of the gains in some groups, there's just so many gains happening right across the board that it's allowing them to, and I think you did some analysis on this, have multiple paths to a majority, where in the past that wasn't always the case.
Yeah, this isn't a case where they have a 5-seat cushion, and if they lose one of these groups, then some of those seats they can lose different groups, appealing to some groups to increase their support if it costs them support elsewhere. They've got lots of different options, which is what makes their position kind of strong right now. Moving on to identity. I thought that you had some interesting breakdowns there. So you broke things down. Respondents who said they had Asian identity, Muslim identity, LGBTQ+, and then you also had a breakdown whether people were born in Canada or not, so immigration. Some big movements among some of these groups. What was your takeaway from this?
Well, I think, first of all, it's, we often group particularly when it comes to like ethnic or racialized groups, we just sometimes just group them all and we think they're all the same and they move the same. That's not the case. And I think by breaking it out the way we did, and we don't have all like a lot of different groups, but we do ask people, do I self-identify as Asian or Muslim, which again, one's religion and one's where people are from. It still shows there's differences. So for example, if you're somebody who identifies as Asian, and that's still a very broad group because we know that South Asians and East Asians, and even within the South Asian community, right now with sort of the I'm going to call it the conflict or the debate around India and Sikh and all those kinds of things means that even that group isn't uniform in how they view politics and the choices. Among those who identify with Asians, we've seen the Conservatives gain 5, so not as big as some of the other groups. The Liberals, though, have lost 11 points among those who self-identify as Asian. And the biggest swing that we've seen, which I think is indicative of the challenge the Liberals have had in managing the Middle East conflict right now, is among those who self-identify as Muslim. The Liberals are lost 29 points from the last election. They still lead among Muslim Canadians, but the Conservatives have gained 11, the NDP have gained 3, and then the rest have sort of gained in other parties. So big swings among that group. That's interesting. Now, when you take a group like, say, those who self-identify as LGBTQ plus, here's one group, for example, that represents, I think, in our sample, about 10% of Canadians self-identify in this way, and there's a big difference depending on age. But in this area, the Conservatives have made almost no gains among those who self-identify as LGBTQ plus. The NDP are up 3, the Liberals are down 9, but the Conservatives have only gained 1. So the NDP, maybe the Bloc, maybe the Greens have been the biggest beneficiaries of any decline for the Liberals there. So again, you take these large, important groups, identity groups in Canada, and they're not all behaving the same way because there's a number of issues surrounding them, I think, that make them react differently to their political choices right now.
Some of the, just to drill down again into some of them, because Muslim identity, you still have a lead of 5 points for the Liberals, which, depending on the sample, still, could be effectively a tie. But it just kind of shows the fact they lost 29 points, how much they dominated that vote in the last election, getting over 60%. A lot of those seats, where that vote is concentrated, that is going to be hard to hold. Some of the, you think about seats like in Mississauga, for example, if the Liberals are losing 30 points, they're not going to hold a lot of those seats among Muslim voters. And then, yeah, I think it's worthwhile to point out that we've been talking about these gains, these broad-based gains for the Conservatives, but among LGBTQ plus, you have 39% for the NDP, 24% for the Liberals. So that's in the last election they're effectively kind of tied among this group. Now it's clearly that the NDP is favored, but the Conservatives still only have 16%. So this is really one group, one of the rare groups in the poll, aside from maybe Quebecers, where the Conservatives are just not doing very well. So it does show that while we have been talking about this uniform kind of increase, there are still some groups that are withstanding or rejecting the conservative, the surge that we've seen from the Conservatives among other groups.
Yeah, and if we even look at just immigrants as a large group, which is again a very diverse group, but if we say, okay, have the Conservatives made gains among immigrant Canadians? They have, but not to the same extent as they have with other groups, right? So the Liberals have lost 12 points among those who say they were born outside of Canada. Conservatives have gained about a third of those, so they've gained 4 points, and the NDP's gained just as much. So again, it's not while we talk about these uniform kind of swings, there are subgroups that are reacting differently right now to the choices, and I think reflects both the opportunities and the progress and the success that the Conservatives have had at attracting certain people, but still some of the liabilities and risks that they have that center around some of the party's current positions on some issues, but also a longer term legacy of some things that the party's done in the past or how they've positioned themselves.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about what's been driving this growth and all this kind of thing at a national level. One of the reasons, it was actually the first reason why I wanted to have this conversation and have this data, was to know if we're seeing any demographic differences at the regional level. Because, we're just talking about different groups right now about how they're moving in different directions. Obviously, that is going to be the same case at the regional level. So do you see any big differences in how Canadians in different parts of the country, based on their demographic profile, are reacting to the Conservatives, to the Liberals, to the NDP?
Yeah, we do. There are some, and it was a really good question on your part. I think there's two that really stand out to me. You also highlighted them when we did our first look at the data set. One is in Quebec, where among older Quebecers, the Conservatives are doing quite badly. Like they've made almost no gains. They're having a hard time gaining tractions, and the Liberals actually do best, right? So there's still some historic, I think, legacy and resiliency to the Liberal support in Quebec, and still a resistance to Conservatives in that province. And we see the same dynamic, I think, at play in Atlantic Canada, just in reverse. So, or not in reverse, the same dynamic in the sense that the Liberals, we've seen, if there's one region of the country that has seen the biggest shift away from the Liberals, it's Atlantic Canada, when we look at our data set. But the one group within Atlantic Canada that has at least resisted that pull away from them is older Canadians that live in that region, where the Liberals continue to lead, actually, among older Atlantic Canadians. I think it was those over 60. So there's still a resiliency to that Liberal vote. I think that's reflective of the political culture in Atlantic Canada, an unwillingness maybe to accept the modern Conservative Party. But it does show that there's still some residual support for the Liberals in Atlantic Canada, but it's very much demographic driven.
In Quebec, you have to wonder how much of the Liberal support from among older Quebecers is somewhat nostalgic, right? It's a Trudeau that's leading the Liberal Party, and so you wonder how much of that is driven by the fact that it's that legacy that is keeping older Quebecers still with the Liberals. I think it was over 40% support they had among older Quebecers, but also how much of that would be tied to the Trudeau name. That if it was someone else that came in, particularly someone who wasn't from Quebec, how much of those older Quebecers who see a Trudeau Liberal and think, I've supported that party for decades, might not see the same thing with a Freeland Liberal or a Carney Liberal or whatever it would be. So that was, I thought, one of the interesting breakdowns to see that difference in Quebec. Because, the Conservatives not still seemingly putting some people off among older Quebecers, which might be limiting their growth in the province.
That's a good way of framing it.
You also had, in terms of the regional breakdowns, we had breakdowns by visible minorities, racialized Canadians. Again, Quebec's really stood out here because you see that in the rest of the country, in Ontario and British Columbia, the Conservatives are doing very well among racialized Canadians, upwards around 40% in Ontario and BC, but just 15% in Quebec. They're not. It's a different kind of. We're seeing in the rest of the country that people, live in suburban Toronto and Vancouver, very diverse communities, same kind of movement towards the Conservatives. But in Quebec, a lot of them concentrate on the island of Montreal. Those voters are sticking with the Liberals.
Yeah, and I think it's just reflective of just the difference of Quebec politics relative to the rest of the country, and the role that the Liberal Party, I think, continues to play. Less so provincially now that it's kind of weakened and been really much isolated to the island of Montreal, but still as the counterweight to the majority Francophone Quebecois population, particularly with this CAQ government sort of asserting language rights, the assault on English language universities, all of those things. Although the federal Liberals haven't taken a hard line on it, I think they remain the natural place for racialized Quebecers who aren't Quebecois or may not even speak French as their first language as a natural home. And the Conservatives haven't been able to make themselves out to be that yet in Quebec, and that is why the Liberals remain so strong, along with their support among the Anglophone community in Montreal, in Montreal itself.
One of the reasons why I wanted to chat about this, because we have a general view of who a Conservative is, who a Liberal is, who a New Democrat is right now. But because of the national polls, when you don't have as big of a sample in Quebec, you can't have the demographic breakdowns for it, didn't really know what a bloc voter was. But with this data, we kind of have an idea now of what a bloc voter is. And so what is a bloc voter?
So, it's interesting. I think a bloc voter is certainly a francophone Quebecer.
Yes.
Right? Very few Anglophones support the bloc. So we start there, and that's not surprising, nor that's something the national polls could tell us. But it's interesting. I mean, there's pretty even gender split. They tend to be a little bit older, and I've seen that for many years now, that the bloc has had a difficult time. They still lead among younger Quebecers, but there's a gradient there. They are more popular among older Quebecers. So if you think of folks who lived through and maybe fought for the yes side during the Quebec referendum, there's a legacy there that the bloc, when it was formed, continues to have, that maybe is less relevant to younger Quebecers. We saw that with the PQ and the provincially, and the shift to the Quebec Solidaire as an example of some of the challenges that the nationalist or separatist movement in Quebec has with just engaging younger Quebecers, but they still lead among younger Quebecers. So and they're white, right? These are Quebecois. And people, and that makes up the core base of this party. And where they agree, and you look at some of the views they held, they're not big fans of Justin Trudeau. They don't. I don't think they're all, although we don't ask the question, I don't suspect they're all hardline separatists, but they aren't comfortable with the Liberals. They aren't fans of Mr. Poilievre. They're no longer looking at the New Democrats, and so the bloc, for many of them, becomes, as I like to describe it, a safe harbor, a place where they know they could support this party. They're going to represent Quebec's interests, and unless there's a better alternative for them, it's a safe place for their vote to go.
Yeah, not exactly the same kind of ingredients we might have seen in past elections, where their vote could, it seems like their vote is pretty solid, and we haven't actually seen a lot of movement in the polls for the bloc. If any party has been holding steady, it's been them over the last little while. Okay, let's get to the switchers. So these are people who voted for primarily the Liberals. There are some other switchers, but there's not that many of them. And then have gone over to either the NDP or the Conservatives. So who are these people?
I'm going to actually break it out into two groups, because I think they're distinct, not in necessarily their demographic profile or even their regional location, but how they think about politics and their choices. So if we look at first those who voted Conservative and now say they're going to, voted Liberal, I apologize, voted Liberal and now say they're going to vote Conservative, they represent about 3% of the entire electorate and 4% of those who said they voted in 2021. So again, tiny percentage, but very relevant in terms of election outcomes now, given how close the elections have been in the past. So if that 3% is part of the, if the Conservatives, we think, have gained about 7 percentage points in share, this is about half of that gain. And who are they? Well, almost half of them come from Ontario, so higher index from Ontario and higher index from Atlantic Canada, which explains a lot of the shift in the polls and a significant increase in BC. So if you look at Ontario, Atlantic Canada, and BC, much of the Conservative gains generally have come from those provinces, right? They haven't gained as much in Quebec, and they already had such a dominant place in the prairies that it makes sense that that's showing up in the data. So it's not surprising, but it's reflective in the data that we have. They're more likely to be men. So almost 6 in 10 of these switchers are men compared to 4 in 10 who are women. And they tend to be a little younger, but except for the 60 plus, they're pretty evenly divided among all younger age cohorts. So this isn't overwhelmingly young people. Again, it's pretty broad-based, but they tend to be a little younger than the average Canadian in terms of their demographic. Now, what's really interesting is how do they see themselves politically, and what do they think about politics and sort of the issues. 61% of these liberal conservative switchers place themselves in the center of the political spectrum. 17 points more likely to do that than the rest of voters. Okay, so these are solidly, these are mostly folks who don't see themselves as really ideologically aligned to either wing of the spectrum. They are much more likely to see themselves as in the center. 73% of them have a negative view of the Prime Minister, and 73, exact same number, have a positive view of Pierre Poilievre. So the reason, I think, a big reason why these folks have switched or at least they've come to view that choice through this lens, is that they don't like Mr. Trudeau, and they have found a lot of appeal in Mr. Poilievre. And two issues stand out that differentiates them. One, they are more likely to rate housing as a top issue than the rest of the country. So 57% rate housing as a top issue, top three issue, compared to 47% of everybody else. And they are 10 points less likely to rate climate change as a top issue than everybody else, right? So these are centrist, former Liberal voters who don't put as much emphasis on climate, but put way more emphasis on housing. And I think if you think about Mr. Poilievre and how he's positioned himself, it makes sense why they've embraced him at this point. Last point I'll make, and this is important for Liberals, when we ask them, would you be open to voting Liberal or not anymore? Remember, these are folks, all of them, who said they voted Liberal last time. Today, only 1 in 4 of them say they'd even consider voting for the Liberal Party. So 3 out of 4 of these folks are gone, at least for now. They say they're not even open to voting Liberal, which means getting them all back at this point seems almost impossible. You could maybe get a quarter of them, but that's certainly not enough to make up for the big loss that you would have had to the Conservatives.
So we got centrist pocketbook voters who are gone for the most part from the Liberals, and they don't like Justin Trudeau. They're happy with Pierre Poilievre. Yeah, that sounds pretty tough for the for the Liberals right now, but it also makes a lot of sense, right? It's almost what you would expect. So it's always nice when the data backs up what our kind of pocketbook, our back of the envelope expectations would be. So I mean that's pretty remarkable, though, especially the fact that they consider themselves centrist, because we've often talked about whether Pierre Poilievre has really reached out to the center and all this kind of stuff. It does seem like among these voters that, at least in terms of their own self-perception of who they are, that the Conservatives have been successful in appealing to those centrist pocketbook voters.
These votes, like if the election were today and these voters voted the way they intend to, I wouldn't describe them as plugging their nose to vote for change. They aren't like accepting Pierre Poilievre. There's a little bit of enthusiasm for him as well. And I think that's reflective of their ability to talk about the issues they care about. And as I said, because climate is not as big an issue, even if they don't think Mr. Poilievre is going to take that issue as seriously, that doesn't bother these voters all that much.
Okay, so the second group was those Liberals who've gone over to the NDP. Now, we haven't seen the NDP gain a lot in the polls, so there are some NDP Conservative switchers. I don't know if this data is enough for that to see what they are, but who are the Liberal NDP switchers? Who are the people who've gone over to further to the left rather than to the right?
So it's a slightly smaller group, but still significant, right? 2% of the electorate, 3% of those who voted in 2021. Like the Conservative switchers, no real age difference, tend to be a little bit younger, right? Older Canadians have actually been the most static, if you want to generalize a little bit about them. Younger, those under 60 have been much more likely to move around. They, unlike the Conservative switchers from the Liberals, these Liberal NDP switchers are slightly more female than male, so 53% are women, 40% male, so pretty close 50-50, but you don't have
a big difference from the Conservative Liberal switchers.
Yeah, you don't have that tendency to be much more male, but the same regional dynamics. So more concentrated in Ontario, Atlantic Canada, and BC than the national average, which makes sense because the NDP aren't gaining very much in Quebec, and they haven't made, other than maybe Manitoba, haven't made any real gains in the prairies. So that's where most of the movement's happening. What's interesting, though, is compared to the rest of the population, these are folks who typically have higher levels of education. 85% have a post-secondary degree, which is significantly higher than the rest of the population or the average Canadian population. But what's really interesting is their impressions of the leaders and of the parties themselves. Okay, so not surprising, 85% of these folks say they have a positive impression of Jagmeet Singh. They're saying they're going to vote NDP. We know, and I've seen consistently, that there's a strong, usually, correlation between liking the party leader and then saying you're going to vote for the party. You don't have to, but it's very helpful and usually strongly correlated with that. On the other hand, most of these folks really don't like Pierre Poilievre. 65% say they have a negative view of the Conservative leader. So these are not switchers leaving the Liberals and going to the Conservatives. They are not excited about the Conservatives. In fact, they may want may want to prevent the Conservatives from winning. But what's interesting is how they feel about Mr. Trudeau. And this was actually, when I saw it, I was like, oh, wait a second. Okay. A third have a positive view of Mr. Trudeau, and a third have a negative view. So it's pretty even. In fact, when you compare their views to the rest of the country, they're overwhelmingly positive towards Mr. Trudeau, given that he's got a minus 36 nationally, a plus 6 among switchers. These are people who said, I'm not voting for you anymore, means there may be an opportunity with some of these voters to bring them back, right? They aren't entirely rejecting Mr. Trudeau. I think, these are the kind of folks, when you ask them, what's your emotional reaction to the government? It's not that they're angry at the Liberals. It's probably more that they're just disappointed, maybe a little indifference. And so the NDP right now, maybe on some of the things they're doing, dental care, pharmacare, some of the stuff they're doing around food prices might be attracting them to the New Democrats, but it's not a full-on rejection of the Liberals, which means they could be persuaded to come back, or more of them join the NDP cause if it becomes clear that the Liberals just have no hope.
How many of them would still consider voting Liberal again? Because it was only about a quarter, you said, among Conservatives. So among these Liberal NDP switchers, are more of them still keeping the Liberals in as one of their options?
74%. Right?
I
complete opposite groups. These are two sets of voters that have left the Liberals, but you can see the commonality between those that still are voting NDP and how they view their leaders and the political choices versus those that have embraced the Conservatives. Two different reasons, I think, why they're leaving the Liberals.
How about the NDP Conservative switchers? Because we see, you've talked about how the Conservatives have gained 4 points or 3 to 4 points from these Liberal Conservative switchers. They need some from others. I know non or new voters or people who are part of it. But for that group of NDP Conservative voters, do we know much about them?
So when you look at this group, the first thing to note is I don't have as big a sample size of them. I'm only about 90. I have 92. So let's put an asterisk over some of the conclusions. But I think qualitatively what stands out is one thing is they're more likely to come from British Columbia, which is why you see the kind of switch from the NDP to the Conservatives as opposed to, say, NDP Liberal. Like in BC, that
and those
dynamic
are where
doesn't always
those
exist.
NDP seats are in danger, right?
Yeah, exactly. Think of like the interior of BC, for example, where most Liberals do very poorly, and so the alternative would be the Conservatives to many New Democrat voters. What's interesting is these voters, although they voted NDP last time and now say they're going to vote Conservative, they agree on one thing. They do not like Justin Trudeau, which is why they aren't even going or considering going to the Liberals at all from leaving the New Democrats. They don't dislike Jagmeet Singh overwhelmingly, but they're attracted to Pierre Poilievre. So I think this voter represents a different type of voter who probably doesn't live in a large urban center, who is deeply unhappy with the Liberal government, probably is not thrilled that the NDP has been propping them up, and as a result, if they want change, they see the Conservatives as the best vehicle to deliver the change that they want. So this would be the kind of voter who's not thrilled with the supply and confidence arrangement and probably feels the NDP has let them down a little bit by backing the Liberals, who they really don't like.
All right, then there's one last thing I wanted to chat about because we've already mentioned it a little bit with those centrist voters who voted the Liberals in the past, but that where people place themselves on the spectrum, I really thought it was fascinating because it gave us a portrait of some of these voters, right? So if you look at the Conservatives, you had 85% of people who are on the right who said they would be open or would consider voting for the Conservatives, 84% on the center right, and 51% on the center. So you get kind of the view that the voter pool for the Conservatives is center right voters plus some centrist voters as well. That's where they have some room to grow. But then you see for the other parties, they're all fishing in the same pond.
All are. So the Liberals, the New Democrats, the Greens, and the Bloc in Quebec are fishing more on the left, some in the center, right? So, for example, if you just compare the New Democrats and the Liberals nationally, among those who place themselves in the center, which is about half of Canadians, to keep that in mind, 41% are open to voting Liberal, 39% are open to voting NDP, but they're much more aggressively fighting for the center left vote, where about 2 and 3 of each of those groups are open to voting either Liberal or NDP, right? And the same is true with the lesser extent, but still true with the Greens and certainly with the Bloc in Quebec. So lots more competition on the center left. And the People's Party, which may be the only competition the Conservatives have on the right, have some, I would say, residual accessible voter out there. Their vote has dropped, I think in this aggregate of the surveys, they only have 3% of the vote. So there's still some, but it's down from where it was in the last election. Because half of those who voted People's Party last time say they're going to vote Conservative this time in our sample. And so, the Conservatives have far less competition. I think they've been very effective at undermining, Max Bernier and making him irrelevant and keeping the focus on Justin Trudeau.
I remember from the numbers, it's a pretty pyramid kind of thing. You have a big chunk in the center. You have roughly the same amount of people who say they're center left, center right, roughly the same amount of people who say they're on the right, on the left. And when you look at who's leading among these groups, it really shows why the Conservatives are doing as well they are, because you have the NDP leading among left-wing voters by 12 points over the Liberals. You have the Liberals leading among center left by 11 points over the NDP. So those are big enough gaps, but they're not as big as the 64-point lead the Conservatives have among center-right voters over the Liberals, and the 67-point lead they have over the PPC among people on the right. So the Conservative electorate, while they are getting some support, quite a lot of support in the center, tiny little bit on the left, are just filling up on that center-right, right-wing vote to the extent that the division on the other side is really what's hampering the other two parties from having any traction.
It is, especially when the Conservatives have gained, 10 plus points among centrist voters, 10 points among those on the center right. Like in our sample, among those who identify as being on the center right, 15% of them voted Liberal, said they voted Liberal in the last election. And today they've lost half of that or more in terms of how they would vote today. So the Conservatives are where they are because this large sample allows us to have the confidence to say this, because they have consolidated the right, center right and the right, and then made major gains in the middle. And if they hold that coalition together, unless somehow the Liberals and the NDP, either they're not going to merge in time for the next election, and I don't think they're ever going to merge, or they cooperate in some way, they can't out. The math just doesn't work. Sorry for them. And so the Conservatives, while only having 41% of convened voters, have a dominant position in an electorate that then divides the rest of the 60 among pretty much four other parties.
Yeah. So really some fascinating numbers. If you had to make your elevator pitch on what these numbers mean, everything that we've discussed today, what is the big takeaway when you can look at the demographic data with this kind of detail to try to figure out where Canadians stand today?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is there's no point in commentators or even the parties thinking about subgroups and how do we get women back or young women or because what we're seeing right now, at least at the moment, is a universal swing away from the incumbent government, which is no different than the universal swing we've seen in other countries, because the issue set are universal. The top issues among Canadians are the cost of living, housing, and healthcare. And while there are some subtle variations in terms of younger people more likely to put housing as a top issue, yet older Canadians more likely to put healthcare, they're still universal in that they're the top three issues in every region of the country. They're the top three issues among all demographics. They're even the top three issues among whether you're a Liberal, New Democrat, or a Conservative voter. And so I think we have this massive data set. We dug into it. There are some subtle and interesting stories, but the overall story is that right now the Liberals are in the position they are because the issue set that they are grappling with is universal. And until and if they can change the most salient issues that the public are focused on, they're going to continue to face problems right across the demographic and regional subsets that we see. And while the Conservatives have had trouble with some subgroups, they've made gains right across the board because I think they've been very effective at focusing on the fault, on the dissatisfaction that people feel on those issues coming from the government, and offering some hope that they might be able to do something different on them going forward.
It's going to make for a really different election than the last two, where it was all about individual seats and tiny little demographic changes, 1 or 2 points here or there. Now it is very much that that the Conservatives can do very well, and if the Liberals are going to get back into the game, it can't just be micro targeting certain parts of the country or demographics to try to get there. So really interesting numbers, and we're going to do this again later in the year. So hopefully we'll have some ideas from our viewers and listeners of what we should dig into. But really appreciate this, David, and thanks so much for coming on and sharing this massive data, because it is really great to have this kind of detail.
You're welcome, Eric. Thanks for doing this with me.